Wood smoke stung Cora's eyes, sour and thin. She drove her cracked knuckles into her woolen skirts, trying to scrub away the lingering smell of lye soap and raw onions, but the scent was baked deep into her skin. Winter in the lower valley didn't just chill a body, it hollowed it out. It ate the fat from your ribs, the heat from your blood, and left you a shivering husk waiting for the spring thaw. A rusted iron pot hissed on the hearth, spitting droplets of boiling snow water onto the meager ash. Cora shoved another piece of damp pine into the embers. It didn't catch. It merely smoked, adding to the grey haze, stinging her throat. The heavy oak door rattled on its iron hinges. Cora froze her hand, gripping the cold iron of the fire poker. She didn't breathe. Out here on the ragged edge of the pack's territory, a knock after nightfall meant one of three things. A drunken border patrol looking for an Omega to use a starving rogue wolf looking for meat, or the tax collectors from the high ridge. None of them left without drawing blood. But the door didn't open with a violent kick. It clicked the latch, lifting clumsily, and shoved inward against the howling wind. It was Finn. Her son practically fell over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind him with a desperate shove of his snow-caked boots. He was 8 years old, but looked 5. Malnutrition had stunted him, kept his limbs spindly, and his face all sharp, desperate angles. Right now, he was shaking so violently, his teeth clicked in a jarring, staccato rhythm. "I told you to be back before the sun hit the tree line." Cora snapped the terror of the last hour, instantly curdling into maternal rage. She dropped the poker and crossed the dirt-packed floor, grabbing him by the shoulders. His threadbare coat was soaked through. "Do you want to freeze? Do you want the rot to take your toes?" Finn didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her. His lips were blue, cracked, and bleeding at the corners, but his hands were clamped fiercely over his stomach. He was hunched over, protecting a massive bulge inside his oversized jacket. Cora's stomach dropped. A cold, heavy stone settled deep in her pelvis. "Finn," she whispered, her voice losing all its heat. "What did you steal?" Omegas didn't take things. They survived on scraps. A stolen loaf of bread from the upper tier was enough to earn a public whipping. A stolen piece of meat meant a severed hand. "I didn't steal them," Finn croaked. His voice was raw, scraped hollow by the wind. "I found them, down by the frozen creek. They were crying Ma." He unzipped the jacket. The smell hit Cora before she saw them. It wasn't the scent of the lower valley. It wasn't mud or cheap oats or decay. It was the scent of ozone, crushed pine needles, rich, heavy copper. It was the scent of pure, unadulterated alpha blood, potent enough to make Cora's knees buckle even in its infant form. 2 wolf pups tumbled out of the boy's coat, landing on the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. They didn't move. One was pitch black, its fur matted into rigid spikes of dirty ice. The other was silver, a shade of metallic blinding silver that only existed in the royal lineages of the High Ridge. Both were entirely limp, their ribs showing through their wet coats, their eyes shut tight against the world. Cora stopped breathing. The silence in the cabin became absolute, save for the whining wind outside. "Put them back," Cora said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like a stranger's flat, dead mechanical. "Ma, they're freezing." "I said put them back," Cora shrieked, flinching at her own volume. She grabbed Finn's arm, her nails digging into the thin fabric of his sleeve. "Do you know what these are. Do you know what you've brought into this house? They're babies, Finn cried, dropping to his knees. He reached for the silver pup, pulling its stiff, frozen body against his chest. They're just babies, Ma. They were alone. No mother, no tracks, just snow. They are death, Cora snarled, though her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't maintain her grip on him. She backed away, pressing her spine against the drafty timber of the wall. She hated them. Looking at their pathetic dying forms, she didn't feel a surge of maternal warmth. She felt a primal, suffocating terror. Those coats, that scent. These weren't stray mutts from the village. This was high-born blood. If a patrol found Omega trash harboring alpha pups, they wouldn't ask questions. They would assume theft. They would assume dark magic. They would burn the cabin down with Cora and Finn nailed inside. Wrap them up, Cora ordered, stepping forward and yanking a tattered wool blanket off the nearby cot. She threw it at Finn's face. Wrap them up right now. We are taking them to the edge of the woods. We will leave them in a snowbank. We will walk backward to cover our tracks. No. Finn screamed, tears finally spilling over his frost-bitten cheeks. The salt water immediately began to freeze on his skin. They'll die. They're already dying. As if on cue, the black pup let out a sound. It wasn't a howl or a bark. It was a wet, rattling wheeze, the sound of lungs failing, of a tiny heart sputtering against the ice in its veins. A small puff of vapor escaped its black nose, accompanied by a faint, agonizing whine. Cora stared at the black heap of fur. Survival demanded she throw them out. Every instinct beaten into her over 28 years of a miserable, subservient existence screamed at her to open the door and kick them into the blizzard. Omegas survive by being invisible. You do not touch the fire. But she looked at the pup's chest, barely rising, and then she looked at her son. Finn was weeping openly now, clutching the silver one, pressing his own freezing cheek against its icy snout. Damn it all to hell, Cora thought, a bitter, cynical tear cutting through the soot on her face. Bring them to the hearth. She gritted out her voice hard. Now. The next 4 hours were a physical agony of repetition. Cora dragged the only rug they owned, a moth-eaten thing made of braided rags, directly in front of the sputtering fire. She didn't have enough wood for a roaring blaze, so she had to improvise. She took the smooth river stones she used for keeping the bed warm, shoved them directly into the coals until they were dangerously hot, then wrapped them in layers of torn linen. She lined the pups against the wrapped stones. Rub, she told Finn, tossing him a coarse towel. Don't pet them. Rub them. Hard. You have to force the blood back into their muscles or their hearts will stop. Cora took the silver pup. It was the smaller of the two, its breathing so shallow she had to press her ear against its wet ribs just to confirm it was alive. Up close, the alpha scent was overwhelming. It smelled of privilege and power, an arrogant musk that made Cora's Omega instincts violently recoil. Her hindbrain demanded she submit, bare her throat, or run. Instead, she drove her calloused palms into the pup's flank, rubbing vigorously. The physical reality of the work was disgusting. As the ice melted from their fur, the cabin filled with the heavy, stifling odor of wet, dog-thawing mud and faint traces of old blood. The pups were filthy. Underneath the regal silver and black coats, they were covered in minor scratches and dried earth. Where did you find them exactly? Cora asked, her voice tight with exertion. She flipped the silver pup over, rubbing its belly. It was ice cold, The hollow beneath the weeping willow. Finn murmured, his hands working tirelessly over the black pup. The one near the boundary line. The boundary line. Cora closed her eyes, a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. The boundary line separated the lower valley from the jagged cliffs of the king's territory. No one crossed it, not even the patrols, unless there was a war. Did you see anyone, hear anyone? No. Cora grunted, pressing a freshly heated stone against the silver pup's spine. The skin was so cold it felt like handling raw meat from a butcher's block. She hated the texture. She hated the way the wet fur clung to her fingers. Mostly, she hated herself for doing this. She was risking everything for children that weren't hers. Children of the very caste that kept her wearing rags and eating boiled leather. When these pups grew up, they wouldn't remember the Omega who thawed their frozen lungs. They would bare their teeth at her in the market. They would force her to her knees in the mud. So let them die, a dark, cynical voice whispered in her head. Step back. Let the cold finish them. The silver pup suddenly spasmed. Its legs kicked out rigid and violent, its jaws snapping open. A high, reedy screech tore from its throat. Cora didn't recoil. Her hands moved before her brain could stop them. She scooped the violently shivering creature up, pressing its wet, muddy body directly against her own chest over her thin cotton shirt. She wrapped her arms around it, trapping its frantic movements, using her own core body heat to shock its system. Shh! She shushed the sound, entirely involuntary. She rocked back and forth on her heels, feeling the pup's erratic, terrifying heartbeat thumping against her collarbone. Shh! Stop fighting. Just breathe. Across the fire, Finn was doing the same, with the black pup tears silently tracking through the dirt on his face as he held the whimpering animal to his neck. They stayed like that for hours. Midnight passed. The wind outside shifted from a howl to a low, demonic moan. The frost on the windows thickened, creeping inward, turning the glass into opaque sheets of white armor. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering subsided. The silver pup in Cora's arms went limp, but this time it wasn't the rigidity of death. It was the heavy, boneless slump of exhaustion. Its breathing deepened, leveling out into a steady, rhythmic rise and fall. Cora lowered it back to the warmed stones. She pulled back her shirt, soaked through with melted snow and smelling horribly of wet wolf. She was shivering now, her own body heat depleted. Finn had fallen asleep against the hearth, curled in a tight ball around the black pup, his chin resting on its dark head. Cora didn't sleep. She couldn't. She pulled her knees to her chest, sitting in the darkest corner of the room, her eyes locked on the door. The fire burned down to a dull, pulsing orange glow. The shadows in the cabin stretched and deformed, looking like tall men with broad shoulders. She spent the long, suffocating hours of the night dissecting her doom. Wolves didn't just lose their pups, not alphas. Alphas were fiercely, obsessively protective. A missing pup meant a massacre. 2 missing pups meant a war. Someone was looking for them. Someone with teeth and armies and a total disregard for the life of an Omega widow and her half-starved son. If they found the pups here, they would assume Cora lured them. They would drag her out by her hair. They would make Finn watch. She tightened her grip on the iron poker, her knuckles turning white. She thought about taking the poker to the pups' heads while they slept, ending the threat. It would be easy. A quick strike. Then she could bury them in the cellar under the salted pork barrel. No one would know. She would be safe. She stared at the silver pup. It twitched in its sleep, letting out a soft, tiny sigh that sounded entirely human. Cora dropped her head onto her knees, squeezing her eyes shut. "Damn you," she whispered to the empty room, cursing the pups, cursing the cold, and cursing the wretched, pathetic Mercy that lived like a parasite in her own chest. She sat there in the freezing dark, waiting for the dawn, knowing it would bring nothing but blood. Morning didn't break. It bled. A pale, bruised grey light seeped through the cracks in the frost-choked windows, illuminating the dust motes hanging stagnant in the freezing air. The fire was entirely dead. Only a pile of chalky white ash remained in the hearth. Cora's joints screamed in protest as she uncurled from the corner. Her spine felt like it was fused together with iron rust. She rubbed her eyes, her hands trembling violently from a mixture of bone-deep cold and severe sleep deprivation. On the rug, Finn was still asleep. The two pups were curled tightly against him, a tangle of black and silver fur pressed into the boy's side. They were breathing evenly. They had survived the night. Cora didn't feel relief. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of an hourglass running out. She stood up, intending to boil water for a meager porridge when she felt it. It didn't start as a sound. It started as a vibration, a low, rhythmic trembling in the floorboards beneath her worn boots. The rusted tin cups hanging on the wall began to rattle, a tiny metallic clinking that sounded deafening in the quiet cabin. Then came the silence. The wind had stopped. The winter birds, usually desperate and noisy in the morning, were completely silent. The forest outside was holding its breath. Cora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved toward the window, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't dare scrape away the frost. Instead, she pressed her eye to a splintered crack in the wooden shutter. The tree line, usually a stark, empty expanse of white snow and black pine trunks, was moving. Wolves, dozens of them. They were massive, the size of draft horses, with thick, heavily muscled shoulders and coats that ranged from slate grey to midnight black. They didn't run. They stalked forward in perfect, terrifying synchronization, fanning out in a wide semicircle. They were surrounding the clearing, surrounding her house. Cora clapped a hand over her mouth to trap the scream rising in her throat. Then the scent hit the cabin. It didn't just drift in through the drafts. It slammed into the structure like a physical blow. It was the scent of absolute crushing dominance. Pine pitch crushed granite and an electrical ozone charge so intense it made the hairs on Cora's arms stand up. It was an alpha aura, entirely unrestrained, weaponized to force lesser wolves to their bellies. Finn bolted upright with a gasp, his eyes wide. The two pups woke instantly, whining and scrabbling against the rug, their tails tucking tight between their legs. "Ma," Finn whispered, his voice trembling. Under the floor, Cora commanded, spinning around. Her voice was a harsh, panicked hiss. She threw herself at the corner of the room, dragging a heavy burlap sack of rotting potatoes out of the way. She clawed at the loose floorboard, tearing a fingernail backward, ignoring the spurt of blood as she wrenched the wood up. "Ma, what is it? Get in the cellar," she shrieked, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt and hauling him toward the dark, shallow hole beneath the cabin. Do not make a sound. If you hear screaming, if you hear them breaking things, you do not come out. Do you understand me? You stay in the dark. The pups, leave them. She shoved Finn down into the earthen depression. He was crying silently, his small hands reaching up to her, but she slammed the floorboard back down, kicking the sack of potatoes over the seam. Outside, a heavy thud shook the earth. Someone had dismounted a horse. Footsteps crunched through the deep snow, slow, deliberate. Heavy boots laced with steel. Cora backed away from the floorboard, her chest heaving. She looked at the two pups. They were cowering by the dead hearth, trembling violently, their eyes locked on the door. She knew who was out there. You didn't live in the lower valley without knowing the scent of the king. Reese, the alpha king of the northern ridge, a warlord who had conquered 3 neighboring territories before his 25th winter. A man rumored to execute his own generals for insubordination. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side of her thin wooden door. Cora couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin felt thick, syrupy, laced with the paralyzing venom of the king's pheromones. Her Omega instincts screamed at her to drop to the floor, to press her face into the dirt and expose her neck. It took every ounce of her cynical, hardened willpower to remain standing. I am dead, she thought. The realization brought a strange, icy clarity. I am going to die right here in my filthy kitchen. Crack. The door didn't open. A massive, gauntleted fist slammed into the wood, splintering the center panel. Open the door, a voice rumbled. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed Cora's ears and vibrated directly in her sternum. It was perfectly calm, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Cora swallowed the bile in her throat. She wiped her bleeding, cracked hands on her skirt. She didn't grab the poker. A weapon was a joke against what stood outside. She walked forward, her boots dragging on the dirt floor, and lifted the latch. The door swung open, caught instantly by a violent gust of wind. Cora looked out into the freezing morning, and her blood turned to ice. He stood on her sagging porch, a towering silhouette against the glaring white snow. King Reese was not in his wolf form, but he might as well have been. He was massive, clad in dark leathers and heavy furs, his broad shoulders practically filling the doorway. His face was a harsh, geometric landscape of sharp cheekbones and a brutal jawline scarred from years of frontline combat. But it was his eyes that stopped Cora's heart. They were the color of glacial ice, pale and piercing, burning with a violent, contained, manic energy. He was looking down at her, not seeing a woman, not seeing a citizen. He was looking at an obstacle, an insect. Behind him, the yard was a sea of massive, snarling wolves, their breath pluming in the frigid air like smoke from a battlefield. Reese didn't speak immediately. He inhaled, his chest expanding beneath his furs as he pulled the scent of the cabin into his lungs. He was smelling the stale wood smoke, the sour onions, the underlying scent of Omega fear. And then his gaze snapped from Cora's face down to the floor behind her. He smelled them. "Step aside," Reese commanded, his voice devoid of any human warmth. Cora didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her small, trembling frame blocking the entrance. It was a suicidal act of defiance. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her legs refused to obey. She was terrified, yes, but beneath the terror was a dark, stubborn core of absolute exhaustion. She was so tired of being stepped on. "They are inside," Cora said. Her voice was raspy, shaking badly, but she met his pale, terrifying eyes. They were freezing to death. I thawed them. Rhys tilted his head, a microscopic movement that radiated lethal intent. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her cracked, bleeding hands, the soot on her face, and the terrified defiance in her posture. "You touched my blood," he asked softly. Before Cora could answer, the silver pup let out a sharp, piercing bark from inside the cabin. Rhys moved. He didn't push Cora. He simply walked forward. The sheer physical force of his presence moving into the space forced Cora backward. She stumbled, hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The king stepped into the miserable, freezing hovel, bringing the scent of ozone and impending slaughter with him. Rhys did not inspect the room. He didn't care about the rotting walls, the drafty ceiling, or the pitiful pile of ash in the hearth. His pale eyes locked instantly onto the two pups cowering near the dead fire. The air pressure in the cabin changed as he dropped to one knee. The heavy leather of his armor creaked a harsh sound in the dead quiet. He didn't reach for them immediately. He let out a low, rumbling frequency from deep within his chest, a localized purr, vibrating with absolute authority and strange, unexpected gentleness. The pups froze. Then the black one let out a sharp, pathetic squeak. It broke formation, its tiny claws clicking frantically against the floorboards and threw its entire weight against the king's mud-caked boot. The silver pup followed a second later, dragging its belly on the dirt until it reached his knee. Rhys scooped them both up in one massive hand. They looked absurdly small against his scarred, gauntleted palm. He pressed his face to their fur, inhaling deeply. Cora watched the muscles in his jaw clench thick veins rising against his throat as his senses catalogued every detail of their near-death experience. He smelled the frostbite lingering in the black pup's earlobes. He smelled the smoke, the hot stones, the lye soap. And he smelled Cora. His head snapped up. The gentleness vanished from his posture, replaced by a rigid, terrifying violence. He stood towering over the low ceiling, his pale eyes pinning her to the wall. "You rubbed your scent on them," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I rubbed the blood back into their veins so their hearts wouldn't stop," Cora shot back. The words tore out of her throat before she could filter them. Her heart pounded, a frantic, sickly rhythm against her ribs, but the bitter resentment of her caste pushed past the fear. "Excuse me if my stink offends the crown, but they were blocks of ice when they came through that door." Rhys took a slow step forward. Cora pressed her shoulder blades flat against the timber wall, her lungs constricting. Close up, the physical reality of the Alpha King was suffocating. He radiated a heat that had nothing to do with body temperature and everything to do with raw, dominant biology. It made her vision swim. It made the back of her knees ache with the biological urge to drop. "Omegas do not touch royal blood," Rhys murmured. He was so close now, she could see the fine silver scars cutting through his left eyebrow. "It taints the lineage. It is an act of defilement punishable by the severing of the hands." Cora barked a harsh, broken laugh. It sounded a bit hysterical, even to her own ears. "Then cut them off," she said, holding up her cracked, raw hands. They were trembling violently, knuckles split from the cold nails caked with dirt and old soot. "Cut them off, King, because without these hands, your heirs would be frozen meat for the carrion birds right now. Do it." Rhys didn't move. He stared at her hands, then traced his gaze up to her face. He was looking for a lie. He was looking for the manipulative, groveling desperation he usually saw in the lower castes. Instead, he saw a woman running entirely on fumes, fueled by spite and absolute exhaustion. He tilted his head, a predatory curiosity flickering in his glacial eyes. "You hate me," he observed, sounding genuinely fascinated. "I hate this winter," Cora corrected coldly. "You're just the man who owns the snow." A beat of silence hung between them, thick and dangerous. Then Rhys's gaze drifted downward, past Cora's face, past her trembling hands. He looked at the floorboards near the corner of the room. Specifically, he looked at the fresh, smeared drop of blood where Cora had torn her nail right next to the rotting sack of potatoes. Cora's stomach plummeted into a bottomless gorge. She stopped breathing entirely. Rhys inhaled slowly through his nose. His eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide, eclipsing the pale ice of his irises. "There is another heartbeat in this room," the king whispered. Panic, cold, and absolute severed the rational chords in Cora's brain. She didn't think. She just moved. As Rhys took a step toward the corner, Cora threw herself into his path. She slammed her hands flat against his heavy leather chest plate, shoving him with every ounce of strength, her malnourished body possessed. It was like trying to push a mountain. Rhys didn't even sway. "Don't!" Cora snarled, her voice dropping into a feral, desperate octave she didn't know she possessed. She clawed at his armor, trying to dig her nails into the seams. Leave him alone. He had nothing to do with this. Rhys looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He caught her wrist with one hand, his grip like an iron vice. It didn't break her bones, but the absolute immovable strength of it sent a shockwave of terror straight down her spine. He hauled her effortlessly to the side, pinning her arms against the wall with his forearm. With his free hand, he reached down, grabbed the sack of potatoes, and hurled it across the room. It slammed into the stove, splitting open and showering the dirt floor with rot. He hooked his fingers under the loose floorboard and ripped it upward. The rusted nails screamed as they were torn from the joists. Finn was curled in the shallow dirt depression, his knees pulled to his chest, his eyes wide and leaking silent tears. He was shaking so hard, his teeth audibly rattled. "No!" Cora screamed, struggling violently against the king's grip. She kicked at his shins, a wild, uncoordinated thrashing. "He's just a boy. He's an Omega. He doesn't know any better. Take me, take my hands, leave him." Rhys ignored her. He stared down into the hole. "Get up," Rhys commanded the boy. Finn couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the pure, unadulterated terror radiating from the king. Rhys didn't repeat himself. He reached down, grabbed Finn by the back of his threadbare coat, and hoisted him out of the hole like a rag doll. He dropped the boy onto the floorboards. Finn scrambled backward, pressing his back against the wall next to Cora, gasping for air. He found them. Cora rushed out the words, tumbling over each other in a desperate bid to keep the king's violence focused on her. He found them by the weeping willow at the boundary line. There were no tracks, no mother, just the snow. He brought them here. If he wanted to hurt them, he would have left them to freeze. You know that. Look at them, you arrogant bastard. Look at them and tell me he hurt them. Rhys slowly turned his gaze from Finn back to Cora. The insult hung in the air, sharp and deadly. A lesser alpha would have ripped her throat out for the disrespect alone. But Reese's attention was suddenly drawn downward. The silver pup, still cradled against Reese's heavy chest armor, began to squirm. It kicked its hind legs, letting out a sharp whine. Reese loosened his grip slightly. The pup scrambled down his arm, hit the floor with a soft thud, and immediately wobbled across the room. It ignored the king. It ignored the warm, safe smell of its own pack waiting outside. It went straight to Finn. The silver pup pushed its cold, wet nose under Finn's trembling hand, letting out a low, content huff. It curled up directly over the boy's worn boots, resting its chin on Finn's ankle. The silence in the cabin became absolute. Outside, a massive black wolf growled, sensing the delay. Reese didn't look at the door. He stared at the silver pup, then at the terrified, starving Omega boy, and finally at the feral, protective mother still pinned against the wall. Alpha blood does not bond with Omega dirt, Reese said softly, almost to himself. It was a fact, a biological law of their kind. Alphas ruled, betas served, Omegas scavenged. There was no overlap. My son isn't dirt. Cora spat, her voice trembling but hard as iron. Reese released her wrists. He took a step back, giving her space. Cora immediately slumped sideways, throwing her arms around Finn and pulling his head against her chest, shielding him with her own body. No, Reese said, his voice strangely hollow. He isn't. The king unclasped the heavy fur cloak from his shoulders. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy, expensive thud. Who killed your mate? Reese asked abruptly. Cora flinched. The question felt like a physical blow. What? You smell of old grief. Dead mate. No pack scent. Reese's eyes narrowed, dissecting her. Who killed him? The winter. Cora lied, her voice flat. Reese caught the slight hitch in her pulse. You are a terrible liar for someone so desperate to survive. He stepped toward the door, turning his back on her. It was the ultimate display of dominance, showing his back to a potential threat, knowing she was too weak to strike. Pack your things, Reese ordered, his voice returning to the rumbling baritone that carried over battlefields. What? Cora asked, her stomach twisting. You have 5 minutes. Gather whatever rags you deem essential. You and the boy are coming with me. No. The word snapped out of Cora's mouth before common sense could strangle it. She tightened her grip on Finn, pressing him harder against the wall. We are not going anywhere, Cora said, her voice rising in pitch. You have your heirs. Take them. Leave us. We won't say a word to anyone. We don't exist. Reese stopped in the ruined doorway. The wind whipped his dark hair around his scarred face. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes devoid of mercy. You touched my blood, Reese repeated coldly. The scent of my heirs is baked into your skin, into your boy's clothes. Do you know what happens when the border patrols smell that on an Omega? They won't ask questions. They will assume you kidnapped them for ransom. They will skin you both alive and hang you from the weeping willow as a warning. Cora's jaw clenched. She knew he was right. The brutal reality of their world didn't allow for nuance. But going to the high ridge, the king's stronghold was jumping straight into the fire to avoid the smoke. Your court will tear us apart, Cora whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a cold, bitter dread. An Omega in the king's den. They'll use us for sport. No one touches what is mine, Reese said. I am not yours. You saved my blood. By the old laws, Your lives belong to me." He turned fully around, his sheer mass blocking the grey light of the morning. "This is not a negotiation, Cora. You walk out that door on your own 2 feet, or I drag you out by your hair. Choose." He knew her name. The realization hit her like a stone to the temple. He hadn't asked. He just knew. Before she could process it, a shadow fell over the porch. A man stepped up beside the king. He wasn't in wolf form, but he was just as terrifying. He wore heavy chainmail over dark leather, a cruel, jagged scar splitting his lip. He was a beta, one of Rhys's generals, and he smelled of cheap wine and dried blood. "My king," the man rasped, his eyes dragging over Cora with blatant, sickening disgust. "The perimeter is secure. No sign of the kidnappers. Shall I burn the hovel and silence the trash?" He unhooked a heavy iron torch from his belt, striking a flint. Finn buried his face in Cora's neck, whimpering. "Put it out, Cale." Rhys ordered, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal warning. Cale hesitated, the spark catching on the oily rags of the torch. "Sire, they are Omega. If word gets out that this filth harbored the princes..." Rhys moved faster than human eyes could track. 1 second, Cale was holding the torch, and the next, Rhys had him by the throat. The king lifted the massive beta entirely off the ground, slamming him backward against the wooden support beam of the porch. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Cale choked his hands, scrabbling uselessly against Rhys's armored forearm. "I did not ask for your counsel," Rhys snarled. The air in the yard grew instantly heavy, the overwhelming pressure of the king's alpha aura slamming down on everyone present. Outside, several of the massive wolves whined, dropping their bellies to the snow in submission. "They come with us," Rhys commanded, dropping Cale into the snow like a discarded rag. The general gasped for air, coughing violently, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the king's boots. Rhys turned back to Cora. His chest heaved once, settling his fury. 5 minutes, he repeated. He walked out into the snow, scooping the silver pup from Finn's feet as he went. The black pup was already trotting behind him. Cora stood in the wreckage of her kitchen. The cold wind howled through the broken door, biting into her damp skin. She looked around the miserable little hovel. It was a prison of poverty and hunger, but it was hers. She knew how to survive here. "Ma," Finn whispered, pulling at her sleeve. "Are they going to eat us?" Cora looked down at her son's bruised, terrified face. She wiped the dirt from his cheek with her thumb, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, cynical survival. "No," she said softly. "They only eat things that are afraid." She moved quickly. There wasn't much to pack. She grabbed a coarse wool blanket, a small hunting knife she kept hidden under the mattress, and a wooden carving of a wolf that Finn's father had made before he died. She shoved them into a canvas sack. She didn't grab the lye soap. She wouldn't need it where they were going. She took Finn's hand, gripping it tightly. "Listen to me," Cora whispered, kneeling down so she was at his eye level. "When we get up there, you keep your eyes down. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not touch the food until they tell you to eat. You become a ghost, Finn. Do you understand?" Finn nodded frantically. "Good." Cora stood up, slinging the canvas sack over her shoulder. She didn't look back at the dead hearth or the shattered floorboards. She stepped out of the cabin, the freezing wind instantly tearing at her thin skirts. The yard was a nightmare of muscle and teeth. Over 30 massive wolves stood in the deep snow, their yellow eyes fixed entirely on her. They smelled of violence. In the center of the pack stood Reese. A massive black stallion had been brought forward, its breath pluming in the air. The king was already mounted, the two pups secured in a heavy leather satchel slung across the saddle horn. He looked down at Cora, holding out a gloved hand. Cora stared at it. Taking his hand meant accepting her new reality. It meant submitting to a world that saw her as less than livestock. She ignored his hand. Gripping the saddle's rigging, she hauled herself up, swinging her leg over the back of the massive horse sitting rigidly behind the king. She reached down, grabbed Finn by his coat, and pulled him up, settling him securely between her and Reese's broad back. Reese glanced over his shoulder, a ghost of a smirk pulling at the scarred corner of his mouth. He didn't say anything. He whistled a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the wind. The wolves turned as one, a silent, terrifying army of shadow against the snow. Reese spurred the stallion forward. As they rode out of the clearing, Cora didn't look back at her home. She buried her face against the thick fur of the king's cloak to block out the biting wind, closing her eyes as the steady, powerful stride of the warhorse carried her out of the lower valley and straight into the jaws of the beast. Altitude sickness hit Finn first. The massive warhorse's relentless, muscular stride chewed through the steep, winding mountain trails, carrying them higher into the jagged peaks than Cora had ever been permitted to go. The air up here was different. It lacked the heavy, rotting moisture of the lower valley, replaced by a razor-thin, biting wind that tasted of crushed granite and ancient ice. Finn buried his face in the coarse wool of Cora's coat, his small fingers digging painfully into her ribs as his stomach heaved. Cora held him tight, her own thighs screaming in agony. She wasn't built for riding. Her legs were cramped, the freezing leather of the saddle leaching the last remnants of heat from her bones. Ahead of her, King Reese sat perfectly rigid, an immovable wall of dark fur and armor cutting through the blizzard. He didn't speak. He didn't check to see if they were still holding on. He simply drove the pack forward, a silent warlord returning to his fortress with his salvaged bloodline. When the iron gates of the High Ridge stronghold finally loomed out of the whiteout, Cora's breath caught in her raw throat. It wasn't a castle. It was a brutalist monument to violence. Walls of sheer, unpolished black stone rose from the mountain itself, entirely devoid of glass windows or delicate stonework. Thick iron braziers hung from the parapets, burning a heavy, resinous pine pitch that filled the courtyard with a thick, choking black smoke. As the horse clattered over the cobblestones, the sensory assault became unbearable. The courtyard was teeming with high-born wolves. Dozens of alphas and betas turned to watch the king's return. The sheer density of their pheromones, arrogant, heavy, saturated with raw meat and privilege, hit Cora like a physical wall. Her omega instincts violently revolted. Her knees shook so badly she nearly slid off the horse. Every biological imperative she possessed screamed at her to drop to the stones and bare her neck to apologize for breathing their air. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Focus on the pain, she told herself. Don't show them your belly. Reese brought the stallion to a halt near a massive set of oak double doors. He dismounted in one fluid, heavy motion, his boots cracking against the frozen stone. Before Cora could figure out how to get down with her numb legs, a woman stepped out of the gathered crowd. She was stunning in a terrifying, predatory way. tall with sharp, aristocratic features and hair the color of spilled ink. She wore a cloak of pure white fox fur that dragged through the snow, unbothered by the wet. She smelled of distilled rose water and freshly killed venison. "My king." The woman purred, her voice carrying easily over the wind. "Lady Margot." Her eyes didn't even register Cora's existence. They were locked onto the leather satchel at Reese's saddle horn. "The scouts said you found nothing. But the scent." "The scouts were blind." Reese rumbled, his voice echoing off the black granite. He reached into the satchel. The courtyard held its collective breath as Reese lifted the black pup, then the silver, showing them to the court. A low, reverent murmur rippled through the assembled wolves. Margot stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with sudden, terrifying intensity. She reached out her long, manicured hands. "Give them to me. I will have the healers draw a hot bath and bleed a calf for them immediately. They smell of—" Margot's nose wrinkled in sudden, violent disgust. She finally looked past the king, her dark eyes landing on Cora and Finn, who were still perched awkwardly on the massive horse. "Sewage. They smell of the dirt that saved them," Reese corrected. His tone was casual, but the underlying frequency of his voice made Margot freeze. Cora couldn't wait any longer. Her legs were going dead. She gripped the saddle horn and slid off the horse, pulling Finn down with her. The moment her boots hit the uneven cobblestones, her exhausted frozen legs completely gave out. She hit the ground hard, her knees scraping against the ice, dragging Finn down into the snow beside her. A cruel, mocking laughter rippled through the courtyard. Several baiters sneered, pointing at the pathetic pile of rags that had fallen from the king's horse. "Get up," Cora hissed to herself, her cheeks burning with a humiliation so deep it bypassed anger and settled into pure, cynical hatred. She scrambled to her feet, hauling Finn upright and shoving him behind her skirts. She wiped the dirty snow from her chin and glared at the laughing crowd. Margot sneered, stepping closer. "Sire, why have you brought this filth into the sanctum? Send it to the lower kitchens or let the hounds have it. The stench is offending the elders." Reese didn't look at Margot. He looked at Cora. He watched her back straighten, watched the feral, cornered animal glare she leveled at the high-born woman. "The Omega stays," Reese announced. The laughter in the courtyard died instantly. It was as if someone had sucked the air out of the keep. "She and the boy will be quartered in the East Wing, on my floor." Margot recoiled as if she had been slapped. "My king, you cannot be serious. The East Wing is for the royal court. You cannot put a scavenging rat in the low, guttural snarl ripped from the leather satchel." Before Reese could hand the pups over to the waiting healers, the silver pup wriggled violently, its tiny claws tearing a gash in the expensive leather. It tumbled to the cobblestones, hit the ground running, and darted straight past Margot's expensive white boots. It slammed into Cora's shin, letting out a frantic whine, and immediately wedged itself between Cora's worn boots and Finn's trembling legs, baring its tiny needle-like teeth at the entire courtyard. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a sacrilege. A prince of the bloodline rejecting a high-born alpha to seek protection from an omega in rags. Margot's face flushed a violent, ugly red. She took a step toward Cora, her lips pulling back to reveal elongated canines. "You bewitched them, you filthy little—" "Margot," Reese said. He didn't yell. He didn't snarl. He just said her name. But the sheer suffocating weight of his alpha command dropped 3 nearby guards straight to their knees. Margot snapped her mouth shut, her body trembling with restrained, humiliated fury. Rhys walked over to Cora. He towered over her, blocking the biting wind and the hateful stares of his court. He looked down at the silver pup guarding her boots, then up at her soot-stained, exhausted face. "Walk," he commanded softly. Cora didn't argue. She turned, keeping Finn tucked tightly against her side, the silver pup trotting fiercely at her heels. The inside of the keep was a stark contrast to the freezing yard. It was stiflingly warm, heated by massive subterranean furnaces. The air smelled of roasting pork, mulled wine, and dry wood. They walked through long, vaulted stone corridors draped in heavy tapestries. The opulence was nauseating. Every gold candelabra they passed could have fed the lower valley for a month. Rhys finally stopped in front of a heavy, iron-bound oak door. He pushed it open, gesturing for them to enter. Cora stepped cautiously over the threshold. The room was massive. A roaring fire crackled in a hearth the size of her entire cabin. A massive 4-poster bed draped in thick furs dominated the center of the room. In the corner, a copper tub steamed, filling the air with the scent of clean water and lavender. On a heavy wooden table near the fire, a tray of roasted meats, fresh bread and cheese sat waiting. Finn let out a small, desperate whimper at the sight of the food. He lunged toward the table. "Stop!" Cora snapped, grabbing the back of his collar. Rhys, who had followed them inside and closed the door, raised an eyebrow. "You would deny a starving boy food." Cora glared at him. "I would deny him a ruptured stomach. He's eaten nothing but boiled oats and tree bark for a week. If he eats that fat, he'll vomit blood by midnight." She walked to the table, ignoring the heavy, imposing presence of the king. She took a small knife from the tray, cut a tiny thumb-sized piece of the crusty bread, and dipped it briefly into a bowl of clear broth. She handed it to Finn. "Eat this, slowly. Chew it until it's water." Finn nodded miserably, taking the soggy bread and chewing with exaggerated slowness. Rhys watched her. He watched the practiced clinical way she managed her son's starvation. He watched her ignore the opulent bed, the hot bath, and the overwhelming wealth of the room, focusing entirely on survival. The black pup, who had been carried up by a silent servant, suddenly bounded into the room, joining its sibling at Finn's feet. They curled up on the thick woven rug, exhausted but safe. "They won't let us live here," Cora said quietly, her back still to the king. The warmth of the fire was finally beginning to thaw her frozen hands, making her fingertips burn with sharp, prickling agony. "You're caught. That woman in the yard. They will find a way to kill us the moment you leave the keep." "Margot is a vulture," Rhys replied, walking slowly toward the hearth. He unbuckled his heavy sword belt, laying it onto a nearby chest, with a dull metallic clatter. "She commands the southern border patrols. She is necessary, but she does not rule this keep." "I don't belong in a gilded cage," Cora said, finally turning to face him. Her voice lacked the fire it had down in the valley. Now surrounded by stone walls and locked doors, the reality of her captivity was settling in. "I am an Omega. I am meant to be invisible. You brought a target into your house and painted it on my son's back." Rhys stopped. He looked at her, his pale glacial eyes catching the orange light of the fire. The manic, violent energy he had carried in the valley was gone, replaced by something heavier, something deeply contemplative. "You are an Omega," Rhys agreed, his voice a low, vibrating rumble in the quiet room. But you are not invisible, Cora. You stood between a king and his wrath. You dragged my blood back from the ice. He took a slow step closer. The heat radiating off his massive frame mingled with the heat of the fire. You think this is a cage, Rhys murmured, stopping just inches from her. He reached out his large, scarred hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before his thumb brushed lightly against her soot-stained cheek. The touch was shocking, not violent, not demanding, but terrifyingly gentle. It is a fortress, and until I say otherwise, no one inside these walls will ever bare their teeth at you again. Cora stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, trapped between the cynical reality of her world and the dangerous, intoxicating heat of the monster who claimed he was keeping her safe. Did you feel the chill of the lower valley and the heat of the king's gaze? If Cora's fierce survival instincts kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with your pack. Subscribe to our channel for more dark, immersive werewolf dramas and intense romance tales. Do not miss what happens next in the High Ridge. Ring the bell and join today.